Probably not the fault of the catechists. Sometimes we're just not ready to hear something until our hearts are asking the right questions. In his teens, he read about Hindu meditation and New Age stuff, but then he went to college and fell in love with a minister's daughter. He was soon drawn into evangelical churches where he enjoyed the worship and the Bible teaching. And so Jeff trained as a pastor, and for 12 years he led Protestant churches. But the more he studied the Bible, the more he had to preach on John chapter 6, the more he was forced to conclude that what Jesus really asked of us was we should receive his body and blood. That Jeff must take communion in a church that really believed that was what it was. And so Jeff resigned his post as a Protestant minister, and he was reconciled with the Catholic Church. Well, I hope that didn't upset you too much, but maybe this will. Our second reading today is probably the most contentious one in the whole 3-year cycle of readings, because it contains those challenging words, wives, submit to your husbands in everything. Now, there's some balance in there. The opening lines, of course, call husbands and wives to submit to each other in self-sacrificing love. And there are 162 words of instructions to husbands. Yes, someone counted, not me, but someone counted against only 47 words of instruction to wives. Nevertheless, there's still challenging language in there, and in 1 Corinthians, St. Paul sets it out another way to explain the why. Jesus, although he's God, submits to his Father. Every believing man submits to Jesus, and because marriage, Christian marriage, not worldly marriage, is meant to be a living icon of how Christ relates to the church, that's the reason the Bible does give this challenging language of the believing wife submitting to her husband. He says this is an image of how well the church submits to Jesus. I think we have to look around ourselves as a church and say, how well do we do at doing things God's way, not our way in all things? And then there are other upsetting things in the church. In fact, there are many aspects of the Catholic Church that upset people, and for different reasons. And here we have to distinguish between bad behaviour, which is the church not obeying Christ the way it's called to, from that teaching that comes from God that's really challenging. Because yes, when we look back on our history, from the Inquisition of centuries ago to the abuse scandals of the last generation, the Catholic Church has not always behaved in the way that God would have wanted it to. And that doesn't come from the values that we stand for. Sometimes the way leaders have dealt with things comes from a naive trust that bad actors can reform, when deep down they can't, or from our belief you should confess and have another go, and some people just can't be trusted to have another go. So we've learned through the school of hard knocks how to balance mercy and controlling bad situations well. But none of those scandals flow from what the church actually stands for. There have been other upsets in our past that come from style rather than substance. About 50 years ago, the church switched from worshipping in Latin to English or whatever the local language was. And many people were upset by that. And then a decade ago, our missal was retranslated to be a less flowing style of English that followed the Latin more slavishly, and some people were upset by that. The new lectionary will come in the autumn, and I'm sure some people will think it's better, and others, once they've heard it, might feel upset by that. The trouble is, when we're called to be one church worshipping together, we always have to do things some way, and we can't please everyone all the time. In a church that has multiple masses, you might have different styles of music at each mass and a choice of times. Our resources now are more limited, so we have to do it some way which won't be everyone's cup of tea. But then there are those matters of substance, and sometimes those upset people. Within the things the church clearly teaches, we know that abortion and euthanasia are always forbidden by God, even in those heart-rending situations where our hearts might say, well, isn't that the most compassionate thing to do? We teach that weapons of mass destruction are never permitted, even when that leaves citizens feeling vulnerable. We accept we're in the midst of a global ecological crisis, even though that's going to make uncomfortable demands on each one of us to consume less and live more simply. And we believe that it's a noble thing to invest some of our resources in the worship of God, even when Judas points out that the money could have been used to help the poor. So in all of these Catholic things I've just laid out, maybe there's something that upsets you. And if there is, it's probably going to be for one of two reasons. One reason you might feel upset is you might think the Catholic Church has got something fundamentally wrong on a matter of substance rather than style. And if that's you, I encourage you to do what Jeff Havens did. Take the time to read, to study and pray and really look into that issue. When you look at Scripture and what the popes have written, you might find there's good reason for the Church to teach what she teaches. On the other hand, the other reason we might be upset by one of these teachings is in our heart of hearts, we know that what the Lord is asking of us through the Church is correct, but it's going to come with a cost. You might have to swallow your pride or change something in your lifestyle, and maybe you're not ready to do that yet. Now, if that's you, remember the story of the rich young man in the Bible, where Jesus looked at him and said, "Leave everything and follow me." On that day, the rich young man wasn't ready to do it. But I like to think that in the fullness of time, he came to his senses and changed his mind. Because the Scripture tells us the Lord had already looked at him and loved him. He was loved. The Lord was ready for him. He just needed to become ready for the Lord. Because ultimately it comes down to this. Is Jesus the Lord? And am I willing to follow him, whatever he asks of me? The first reading presented us with Joshua, the successor of Moses, the one who led the Israelites across the Jordan and into the promised land. And that reading comes from a time that Joshua was near death, and he asked the people to renew their commitment to God. They passed through that season of receiving manna from heaven and a fiery pillar leading them through the dark nights. Those things weren't happening anymore. They no longer needed those direct miracles from God to protect them. So it's easy to let things slip when you're no longer in crisis. But Joshua reminded them that their place in the promised land would only be secure if they kept their covenant with God. And so he asked them if that's what they were willing to do. So can you say what Joshua said? Do you even want to? Or are you too upset? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.